Coming to paperback and e-readers from SJS Direct, Isis, House of Isis, the goddess next door takes on a hustling Hotep high priestess in Harlem in this Afrocentric Isis series adventure. Pre-order Isis, House of Isis on Amazon.com today. There's speculation that Time Warner may be planning to sell DC Comics. And when I take a look at this proposed deal, it may be a great blessing for the DC Comics brand and for many comic fans because when we take a critical look at the entire DC Comics brand, the entire DC Comics brand has been in decline in the publishing division for over 15 years, and cinematically, it has been in decline for the last 7 to 8 years. So, having a new owner may mean we may get a fresh perspective on DC Comics superheroes and a fresh perspective on DC Comics properties. Because when we look at DC Comics right now, the entire brand is severely damaged from the publishing division to licensing and merchandising to adaptations of cinematic properties. DC Comics is languishing far behind Marvel Comics overall as it relates to being a brand. The DC Comics brand has been marginalized by years of mismanagement in the publishing division due to Dan Dido and Jim Lee's inept leadership, and in the cinematic era due to Zack Snyder's dark vision. And thanks to these mismanagers, what has happened to the DC Comics brand is that the DC Comics brand has not been taken seriously by consumers for over a decade. And when you take a real serious look at that, that really shows how deeply damaged this brand is because brand recognition is extremely important in maintaining the value of a property. And when you take a look at DC Comics as an intellectual property, it has lost value over the last 10 years under the ownership of Warner Brothers. And Time Warner selling the DC Comics brand to a owner who would have a vision for it could be the best thing to ever happen to the DC Comics brand. Because as a business guy who has studied business and has a degree in business, I take a look at the big picture as related to DC Comics, and it's a brand that desperately needs a new vision for the 21st century. The publishing division, while it is trying to rebuild itself with this DC Comics rebirth, is just not in a place competitively and has not been in a place competitively for over 15 years thanks to Dan Dido's and Jim Lee's mismanagement. Thanks to their mismanagement, many DC Comics fans have been alienated from the brand, and many new comic fans just aren't coming in because they find the universe to be too cumbersome and too hard to follow. People have had a hard time following the DC universe with all of the events such as Flashpoint, the New 52, the Convergence, and the Rebirth, and there are so many different versions of these characters that it is literally confusing just to try to figure it out at a comic book store. Moreover, on the merchandising side, DC Comics brand has suffered ever since 2011 when Mattel ended the DC Universe Classics line. Ever since then, when they correlated this with the DC New 52 reboot, DC Comics merchandise such as action figures, t-shirts, and other licensed prop merchandise has languished on store shelves. You can go to places like Target and Toys R Us and you can see DC Comics merchandise sitting on the shelves for that has been there for at least 6 months to a year, whereas Marvel merchandise is constantly turning over. And this is because many people have lost their connection to the DC Comics brand and people have become indifferent to DC's superheroes. And the reason why they have become completely indifferent to DC's superheroes is due to the mismanagement of the brand. While they have television shows like Arrow, The Flash, and Supergirl on the air, they just don't have the momentum as related to licensing and merchandising. And then again, that's due to their mismanagement. Because if they have an Arrow or a Flash show, then why aren't there an Arrow or a Flash comic at a comic book store to tie into this for comic readers to get into And why isn't there merchandise out there promoted on the regular? When I looked at the way they handled things with the Mattel Multiverse line, they have not really done a good job of getting these Berlanti adapted characters to licensed merchandise, and their DC Collectibles brand has not done a good job with this either. Instead of people being able to find these characters and discover them, they just have a hard time finding access to them. Meanwhile, the Marvel Cinematic Universe characters can be found at almost any toy store or any drugstore, but DC characters are almost impossible to find in any sort of merchandise outside of a comic shop, or sometimes when you go to a toy store like a Toys R Us or a Target when there's a movie involved with it. Now, Wonder Woman was the only success for Warner Brothers as it relates to DC superhero movies, and it was the only one to be a box office hit. Man of Steel underperformed, Batman v Superman underperformed, and Justice League underperformed. And they all underperformed due to Zack Snyder's dark and gritty vision, which did not really sell to large audiences of families that were coming out these days. A baby boom was going on, and you had Warner Brothers still trying to sell people dark and gritty heroes like it was 1997. This is one of the big problems with Warner Brothers as related to the cinematic part of adapting DC properties. Warner Brothers' vision for DC properties is still stuck in the 1990s, and I'd even say back in the late 80s when Tim Burton's Batman was the big movie. They're still stuck trying to use the same approaches from the 1990s in the 2010s, and it shows us that Warner Brothers is completely out of touch as it relates to developing their intellectual properties, because we can still see that same dark and gritty vision as related to many of their CW shows, and that approach is really starting to hamper them because the ratings for their shows is now starting to decline. And when I look at the DC brand, it's a brand that desperately needs new vision and a new leader over it, and it needs a company that is willing to take the time to develop DC Comics overall as a brand, focusing on building up the publishing division so that it can be a competitive division that sells comics to younger and older readers and readers of all ages, developing the merchandising division so it can be a competitive division so that people will want to go out here and actually have an interest in DC Comics merchandise. Because when I take a look at message boards like the Foosh and Mattel announces DC Multiverse action figures these days, instead of people becoming enthusiastic like Marvel Legends collectors are, most DC Multiverse announcements are met with indifference and apathy, and there has to be somebody there who can bring back the enthusiasm and energy that the DC Comics brand had as related to action figures and merchandise that it had back in 2008 when the DC Universe Classics line was in its prime. Back when the DC Universe Classics line was in its prime, you had people with a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of passion for DC Comics action figures and the merchandise, but that enthusiasm and passion has cooled due to the New 52 relaunch, and it has never come back to the level, even with this DC Comics rebirth. We have not seen people getting excited for the DC Comics brand, and that's really hurt the DC Comics brand over the last 10 years because people just don't care about DC Comics. Whenever somebody talks about DC Comics products these days, a lot of times it's met with indifference, and when you go to a place like a toy store, a lot of people are really indifferent to it. They just see these characters and they walk right by them. Back in the 90s, your kid would be crazy over Batman and be looking to buy Batman everything. These days, people just walk right by a Batman and could care less about him, and the same with Superman. And right now, people are starting to cool on Wonder Woman, even though she had a hit movie. People are not really enthusiastic about DC products the way they used to be enthusiastic about them. And the reason why is because Warner Brothers has taken this brand and they have done severe damage to it because Warner Brothers CEO has Kevin Shigura at the time. He's been really indifferent about things and he has not really approached things with the energy that you need to bring people into a product. He really has not approached DC Comics with that type of passion and fervor, and that's why people are so lukewarm on DC Comics. And this is why I believe Time Warner selling DC Comics could be the best thing to ever happen to it. Now, some people are afraid that if DC Comics gets sold, it would wind up destroying the brand, but I think it could revive the brand because they desperately need a new person to over DC Comics and DC Comics properties, and they need a new owner who will care about these characters to make sure that their spirit is maintained and make sure that the catalog is treated with the respect it deserves. Now, some comic fans will sit there and think, without Warner Brothers money, this DC Comics will be lost, but I look at it this way. Warner Brothers right now is hemorrhaging money, and the reason why they're hemorrhaging money is because they invested so much money into many movies that just wound up underperforming, like Batman v Superman, like Man of Steel, and like Justice League. They invested all this money in, but because they had the wrong people putting together these films like Zack Snyder, now they're hemorrhaging money, and now the whole Warner Brothers empire is starting to crumble. And the reason why it's starting to crumble is because they had a CEO who was really indifferent, and they had people running their divisions who just did not, who took things for granted. And because they took things for granted, this is what's led to Warner Brothers wanting to put DC Comics on the block. Time Warner is in serious trouble because they recently sold their Time division to Meredith because they were hemorrhaging so much money. And them putting DC Comics on the block also shows that Time Warner is one of the big five media that looks like it's getting ready to fail. So, them selling off, to me, this is a prime opportunity for an entrepreneur to go out here and take these intellectual properties and make efforts to try to modify them so that they can sell in the 21st century. And I do not mean modify by doing something like the New 52 or Rebirth. I mean make it where you can try to create properties that are accessible to readers of this generation, such as ebooks or mini cartoons or other licensed properties that will appeal to younger audiences and make products that appeal to audiences of all ages. What DC Comics really needs is someone, again, with a lot of vision, a lot of creativity, a lot of passion, and a lot of heart for these characters, and someone who will try to make efforts to try to make these characters accessible for the next generation of readers and DC Comics fans overall. The DC Comics brand, as I see it, has been in serious decline, and it really needs somebody there to make efforts to take that brand and rebuild it for the next generation. And Warner Brothers, as I see it, is just not the company to do that because Warner Brothers is a company that is in serious crisis right now. And if they're selling off properties, they're selling them off because they have taken too many losses and now they want to get out of the game. So it's time for a new player to come in and make efforts to really make this brand what it was over 30 years ago, a major asset that could build wealth for the next generation. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.